but I got into this. So now we're going to switch gears, and we're leaving Spain. And when, if that ever happens, that you get your fill of all the wonderful caminos in Spain, well, you can just head up a little bit, go over the border, and step into France, and maybe try to walk along one of the 4 main pilgrimage routes that traverse, and then, you end up in Spain on the Camino Frances, and you'll find out why it's called the Camino Frances. So one of the 4 principal French routes mentioned in the Codex Calixtinus, the Via Lemovicensis, begins in the Burgundian town of Veslay, and that might have been one of the reasons why I chose it. Burgundy is beautiful, the wine is very nice too. And it traces a path across the center of France to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. Although this 900-kilometer path traverses cities like Bourges, Nevers, Limoges, and Perigo, its principal attractions may be the sweeping expanses of rural landscape and the utter lack of crowds. Pre-COVID, there were statistically 500 to 600 pilgrims a year who walked this route, this road less traveled. UNESCO World Heritage status attests to the route's cultural significance, and as it passes many historical sites and monuments. In 1998, the Vezelay route was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage list as part of the pilgrim routes through France to Santiago de Compostela. So join me on a virtual walk through the heart of France on this exceptionally beautiful road to Santiago. And although the route's Latin name, the Via Lemovicensis, derived its name from the city of Limoges, which, as you will see, is located along the route, the Voie de Vézelay begins its way to the Pyrenees from the Abbey Church, now Basilica, of Sainte Marie Madeleine, or Mary Magdalene, in Veslay, Burgundy. During the first half of the 9th century, pilgrims began to venerate the saint at Veslay in its dramatic hilltop setting. Having laid claim to possessing the relics of Mary Magdalene, Veslay became one of the most important places of pilgrimage in France. The village and the 11th century Romanesque Basilica of St. Magdalene are UNESCO World Heritage Sites of the routes of Santiago de Compostela in France. And here, the setting sun cast this amazing pinkish hue on the basilica. So it had been rainy all day, and then the sun came out, and so I thought that was lovely. So Veslay, located in an area of significant pre-Christian sanctity, was one of the most visited pilgrimage sites of the medieval age. Long known as the Abbey of Veslay, the church came under the title of basilica only in 1920. The history of the basilica has plenty of ups and downs, just like the Burgundian countryside. And here I need to interject a little note. There are ups and downs along this route, but it's nothing compared to the routes leaving Le Puy and out. So it's a much less strenuous walk, although you don't just have flat land. Veslay's Christian history began in 860 AD, when the hilltop site, referred to as the Eternal Hill, was donated for the purposes of a monastery by Gérard, the Count of Roussillon, and his wife Bertha. King Nicholas I in 867 and King Charles the Bald in 868. There's going to be a quiz in a little while, too, so you might want to take notes. Confirmed the donation. King John VIII consecrated the first church in 879, and it was around this time, around 882, that the monks of Vezelay recorded an account according to which the tombs of Saint Maximus and Magdalene at Saint Maxime of la Sainte-Baume in Provence had been opened and their bodies removed, as in stolen, to Vezelay, supposedly to protect the relics from a Saracen invasion. According to her medieval legend, Mary Magdalene had left the Holy Land after Christ's ascension and traveled to Provence, where she converted masses of people to Christianity, and then became a hermit, living out her days in a cave at Sainte-Baume. Shortly afterwards, a second account relates that only the body of St. Magdalene was taken. And for 2 centuries, the account of the monks at Vezelay was accepted. To put an end to the conflicting statements coming out of Provence in the 11th century, the monks at Vezelay presented a document, undoubtedly a forgery, which supposedly confirmed an ancient transfer of the saint's relics to Burgundy. Papal bulls of Lucius III, Urban III, and Clement III confirmed the statement that Vézelay indeed possessed the body of St. Mary Magdalene. The Abbey Church, formerly dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul, was reconsecrated to Mary Magdalene. And accordingly, the tomb of the saint was visited in the 12th century by a host of illustrious pilgrims. And the presence of Mary Magdalene's relics endowed the local abbey with great power, so that it was used as a setting for several important historical events. On Easter Sunday in 1146, in the presence of King Louis VII, Bernard, the abbot of the monastery of Clairvaux, came to Vézelay to preach the Second Crusade. Then, in 1190, it was from Vézelay that Kings Philip Auguste of France and Richard the Lionheart of England jointly launched the Third Crusade. In time, Vézelay's claim to Mary Magdalene was challenged in the 13th century when the monks of the rival Provençal Abbey, that we've just seen at Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, orchestrated the rediscovery of her relics in the true tomb within its own walls in an attempt to reestablish its own preeminence. It worked, and from that time, Vézelay attracted fewer of the faithful to its own abbey church. The pilgrimage allowed the town of Vézelay to rise up around the abbey and increase the monastery's power and prestige. Construction on the present basilica began in 1096 under Abbot Artaud to properly honor the sacred relics and welcome the many pilgrims. The Church of the Madeleine was dedicated in 1104 by Paschal II, Artaud's successor. So dating primarily from the 12th century, the now named Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene has a Romanesque nave filled with light. And we were supposed to be in Vézelay for the winter solstice in December because it was built such that the light shines through, supposedly, in a particular fashion. But unfortunately, we were unable to make that trip due to Omicron. And we thought it was prudent to not go. So next year, maybe December 21st, we'll see. It is the largest Romanesque church in France. The basilica is also famed for its remarkable Romanesque sculptures that adorn the tympana and capitals inside the church. The symbolic and artistic threshold of the church has always been in the narthex, especially in the enormous tympanum of the central portal you see here, which depicts the Pentecost. And it's interesting to note how the sculptor varied the height of the apostles, flanking Christ in majesty, so that they would fit within the semicircular format of the tympanum. Compared with this, the tympanum of the facade is not as interesting. The exterior tympanum of the central portal was destroyed by the hammers of revolutionaries around 1793, as much Cluny itself, for example, was pretty much destroyed around that time as well and before. It's been replaced by a poor 19th century copy of a Romanesque Last Judgment. The basilica's Carolingian crypt has reliquaries holding a few small relics of St. Mary Magdalene. These are not the original relics that brought thousands of medieval pilgrims to Vézelay, for those were burned by French Calvinists during the 16th century French Wars of Religion. The present relics were originally a gift from Pope Martin IV to the Diocese of Sens in 1281 and were given in 1876 by the Archbishop of Sens to Vézelay. So we opted to begin our chemin by walking the 22 or so kilometers to Vézelay from Avallon on the GR13 in November 2017. We took the train from Paris. We had 5 days in this first foray into the Chemin de Vézelay to make our way to La Charité-sur-Loire, about 75 kilometers from Vézelay. We followed the GR 654 out of Vézelay, and we passed through Tannay, Varzy, and Château de Val-de-Bargy before arriving in La Charité-sur-Loire. La Charité is a former river port that grew up around the Benedictine priory of La Charité that was founded on the banks of the Loire River in 1059. The old stone bridge from 1520 leads to the heart of the historic town center dominated by the Romanesque tower, the Tour Sainte-Croix, And the tower now stands detached from the priory church of Notre Dame. And these are the only two remaining fragments of the original church and priory complex, made up of 400 outbuildings of the wealthy Cluniac foundation, allowing La Charité to be named the eldest daughter of Cluny. The priory church appears on the UNESCO World Heritage list of monuments along the Voie de Vézelay, and the present nave dates from the 17th century, but the choir and transept retain some of their Romanesque grandeur. So after having made it to La Charité, we had to head back home, only to pick up the trail again from La Charité, and we made it almost to Limoges, to Saint-Léonard de Noblat, the following summer. That's 2018. And now just a brief note about the guides that are available that you can follow, that follow the historical pilgrimage route. There are choices, so you can pick and choose. Their first is the Le Père Guide, and I obviously just took these images off the internet. I have the books, but I'm like, I'm going to take the picture instead of take the picture, scan, and put it in the PowerPoint. So these are all readily available to be viewed online. So this guide, Le Chemin de Vézelay, it has two routes out of Vézelay, one that heads south to Nevers, and one to the north, so you can see wherever we are. Nevers is here, and the other one, the northern one, goes to Bourges. That join again together in Écusson, which you can't really read. I can't even read it as well. The Dutch Association Guide is another option, and it also has a southern variant and a northern variant out of Veslay, via Nevers and Bourges. And the guide states that if you like nature, you might prefer the Nevers variant, which is more undulating and varied. And if you like culture, the variant via Bourges may be more interesting. So these two converge after almost 300 kilometers in the village of Gargilles. And you can opt for the path as well, third choice, as outlined in the Miam Miam Dodo, which follows the pilgrimage routes outlined in the other two guides, with the two variants leaving out of Veslay, also becoming one in Gargilles. And then just about the way markings of the pilgrimage routes in France. Since 2011, these markings have been regulated, and the paths are marked, the influence obviously from the Spanish caminos, by a yellow shell on a blue background, and by a double marking in the same colors, yellow and blue, according to the method of the Grande Randonnée, or the GR, long distance footpaths that cross all of France, and their markings are red and white though. You have another possibility, and this is to follow the GR 654, one of those long-distance footpaths. And that's what we did from Vézelay to Saint-Léonard de Noblat. And the GR trail takes you to the south through Nevers. The pilgrimage route regularly crosses the GR 654, which also goes from Vézelay to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, with an option of joining up with the Le Puy route on the GR 65 at Montréal du Gers. GR hiking trails prefer small paths, even if that means many, many, many more kilometers for the day's walk. So for this reason, we were picking and choosing between the two. When it was a shorter distance, by 2 kilometers or 3, let's take the Miam Miam Dodo route. The concurrence or not of the Veslay route and the GR 654, or another GR, is indicated in the Dutch Association Guide. It is important to note that all of the guides for the Via Lemovicensis are in French, except for the Dutch guide, which is published in Dutch and in English. It's available online, and it has frequent updates. In La Charité, if you're following the GR 654, the route divides here, not out of Veslay. And the pilgrim needs to make a choice, whether to follow the branch running south to Nevers, which is what we did, or the northern branch through Bourges, whose great attraction is the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, St. Stephen. So we did not walk through Bourges, because we chose the southern route, but fortunately about 3 weeks ago, or whenever our spring break was, we were able to do some car recon of the spots on the Chemin de Vézelay that we had been unable to walk previously. So it's just gorgeous, and we can report that it's a wonderful attraction. So the cathedral was dedicated to Saint Etienne, Stephen, an early Christian martyr, and it's located in the medieval quarter that is still filled with half-timbered houses. The cathedral was built between the late 12th and 13th centuries and is one of France's masterpieces of Gothic art, admired for its proportions and unity of design. I think it's or whatever it's awesome. Owing to its quintessential Gothic architecture, the cathedral was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in its own right in 1992. It was also inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List of the monuments along the Voie de Vézelay in 1998, and is also on the list of historic national monuments in France, Monuments Historiques. And you see the labyrinth, like logo or symbol below the UNESCO World Heritage symbol, that I think it's interesting to find that it's a labyrinthian tower, if you will, but that's the logo for the Monuments Historiques in France. So this cathedral is especially interesting in that it has no transept, which allows the east end of the nave to combine harmoniously right up to the towers at the west end. So it's a beautiful cathedral. After Bourges, the two variants reunite about 160 kilometers later at Neuvy-Saint-Cébrus. So having opted for the southern route, we did walk through Nevers, and we did this for several reasons. In Nevers, the tomb of Bernadette Soubirous, also known as Saint Bernadette of Lourdes, and she was canonized in 1933, is located in the Saint-Eudard convent. So Bernadette is best known for experiencing 18 Marian apparitions, asking for a chapel to be built at the nearby cave grotto at Massabielle. And here in Nevers is a replica of the Massabielle grotto. Bernadette retired to the convent in Nevers, where she remained until her death in 1879. Her incorrupt body remains in a glass sarcophagus, and if you stay at the convent or at the Espace Bernadette Soubirous, as we did, you have free reign to visit her tomb at any time, even in the middle of the night, if you wish to do so. And the second reason for choosing this route through Nevers has more to do with my literary interest in 20th century French literature. I'm especially interested in the work of French author Marguerite Duras, and the female protagonist of her 1959 film script, Hiroshima Mon Amour, was born and raised in Nevers. So I'm like, oh, I read about this years ago. I have to go to Nevers. Never, don't say never to go to Nevers. Leaving Nevers, the path follows the Loire River until where the Loire and the Allier rivers converge. And we cross the Allier on the Guétin Canal Bridge. Built in 1832, it is the largest and most impressive canal bridge in France. I'd never seen one before. I'm like, what? There's water underneath, there's water on top. Obviously, there's a series of locks on either side, and the boats go up. And you'll see that pleasure craft have now replaced the barges filled with merchandise that used the locks and the bridge in the past. A highlight of the early part of the route was staying next to the Château de Grossouvre. The owner gave us, the three pilgrims staying there, not in the chateau, but in lodging nearby, a tour of the castle that he had been renovating for quite some time, 20 years or so. Although, I just learned that the chateau is for sale for $1.4 million, in case you're interested. It still needs a lot of work, though. My summer home. The chateau is from the 12th to the 15th centuries and was built on Gallo-Roman ruins. It was given to the Grivel family by the Duke of Bourbon around 1340, and it has a chapel from the 13th century, as well as this nice tower. Illustrious figures have stayed there, like Catherine de Medici, King Charles IX, Henry III, even Emperor Napoleon I, and Eugenie. And I took the next photo. The dog is really cute, and he was happy to see us walk by. But more importantly, it's interesting to note that you can go to the Church of the Ardennais, and right after that, you're going to go straight to hell, l'enfer. I don't know. So the next 3 days or so, we followed grassy canal towpaths, excuse me, along the Canal de Berry, which was open to traffic in 1840 to the town of Charenton-du-Cher. Then we passed through Marseille, Le Châtelet, Châteaubriand, and La Châtre. After La Châtre, we walked past the Château de Sarzay before arriving in Neuville-Saint-Sepulcre. And the interesting thing about France is, well, you know what they say about Minnesota, a land of 10,000 lakes. You could easily call France the country of 10,000 plus chateaus. Neuville is known for its round church that also appears on the UNESCO World Heritage list. It was built by a local lord, Hugh de Deol, on his return from a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and is modeled after the then in ruins Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The 11th century rotunda from about 1045 is attached to a rectangular nave that was built during the same period. The dome is supported by 11 columns, one for each of the 11 remaining apostles after the departure of Judas, with sculpted capitals around which is an ambulatory with 3 levels of arched galleries rising to the central dome. This church, originally dedicated to St. James and Saint Jacques, but named after another first-century Christian martyr, St. Stephen, Saint Etienne, in the 19th century, was endowed with priceless relics, such as 3 drops of the holy blood and a fragment of Christ's tomb. In the middle of the 13th century, that established it as an important stop for pilgrims en route to Compostela. The church's singular form and possession of such important relics made its connection to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem more striking, and it could be interpreted as a substitute for the Holy Sepulchre, but in the middle of the French countryside. The attached rectangular church was presumed to have served for everyday liturgies, while the rotunda was for pilgrims bound for Compostela or those just wishing to venerate the purported blood of Christ. For literary fans of Georges Sand, the pseudonym of one of the most successful female writers of the 19th century, Amandine Lucille Aurore Dupin, you get to walk through the area she called home in her later life. She seems to have occupied every other village here at some time or another. A native, she was devoted to the region and baptized the area around the village of La Châtre and Gargilles as the Vallée Noire. So the Black Valley, for its, quote, dark valleys with a secret charm, unquote, end quote, that turn almost black on a stormy day. This wooded landscape filled with streams serves as a backdrop to a number of her novels. The village of Gargilles itself served as a setting for one of her novels. It is here, too, that the north and the south branches of the pilgrimage route from Vézelay, as described in the Dutch Guide and the Miam Miam Dodo, join together and continue on as one to the Pyrenees. On the Voie de Vézelay, pilgrims pass through many villages that have been designated as one of les plus beaux villages de France, the most beautiful villages in France, and Gargilles is one such village. Georges Sand spent the last 2 decades of her life here. The village sits on the edge of a ravine and is now home to many artists and artisans and their studios, a museum, and the Georges Sand House. The village has a Romanesque church, too, but much of its interior is covered by green moss. But it also has a crypt with 13th to 15th century frescoes. The superb local Jeep, which was a very nice Jeep, had your own room. It was very nice, and a very nice kitchen and a living room. It was adjacent to this medieval pigeonnier, which was used for carrier pigeons in the past. The chateau of the village now holds painting and sculpture exhibits. Donning the area's rural landscape is an unusual architectural feature in the churchyards or cemeteries of some villages. And the Lanterne de Mort, or the Lanterns of the Dead, these medieval structures, found mainly in the southwest of France, resemble slender lighthouses with an opening at the top to accommodate a burning lamp, and often possess a small devotional altar typically set into the base. And most of these date from between the 12th and the 14th centuries. Their specific function is not readily known, although the presence of a large number of dolmen stones in the area could indicate a link with Celtic funerary rites. and the cemetery at Santiago de Compostela, which you see here, to the north of La Souterraine, has a fine specimen of a medieval lantern of the dead. And also intriguing are these greenhouse-like structures erected over some of the tombs, presumably to protect flowers and photographs from inclement weather. And another example of a 12th century lanterne des morts is found just outside of Saint-Rousseau. The town of La Souterraine is of Gallo-Roman origin, and it still has the 13th century gateway, the Porte Saint-Jean, resembling a mini castle that was part of the town's defensive ramparts, of which some fragments still remain. The 13th century church of Notre Dame was built over a much earlier crypt. And I love the curious figures, you can barely see them in this image, carved above the portal in front of the porch, and this one in particular appears to be growing hair, sprouting hair. As I mentioned above in my discussion of the Lanterns of the Dead, the route also passes by two dolmens not far from La Souterraine. You have the dolmen of Saint-Priest-la-Feuille, and then you have the dolmen du Chirou. Voilà. Pilgrims continue their way through the sweeping, heavily wooded countryside past La Souterraine and eventually arrive at Bénévent-l'Abbaye. And somebody carved a tree trunk into a bench, which I thought that was interesting. It was an important stage on the Chemin de Saint-Jacques, and its admirable 12th century Romanesque abbey church attests to that. The town, founded by the Augustinians in the 11th century, takes its name from the Italian city of Benevento to the northeast of Naples, from where the relics of St. Bartholomew were transferred to Benevent in the 12th century. They don't mention which relics, the type of relics, it's not specified. The polylobed west portal of the church is reminiscent of Moorish architecture, and its presence is possibly a result of Benevent having been settled by North African Muslims. The aisle arches appear to resemble architectural details from Andalusia rather than from rural France. From Bénévent-l'Abbaye, pilgrims also have the option of taking a secondary path to Rocamadour, and you can also get to it from the Le Puy route. And so you can follow this marking to get to Rocamadour, which is a beautiful hilltop location. And if you keep going, you can join up with the Le Puy route if you continue on to Perigueux. We did not go that way this time. So Saint Léonard de Noblat is particularly singled out as a must-see by Emery Picot, the supposed author of the 12th century Pilgrim's Guide, Book 5 of the Liber Sancti Jacobi that we heard about from Mary Jane yesterday. After crossing the Pont du Dognon, you arrive in the city of Saint Léonard, and the town was established in the Middle Ages around the tomb of Saint Leonard, and it and his relics are housed in the church of Saint Leonard. This Romanesque church, collegial church, and its bell tower, dating partly from the 11th century, is another UNESCO World Heritage Site connected with the routes to Santiago in France. So Saint Leonard was a Frankish noble at the court of Clovis I, and in 496 AD, they both converted to Christianity. During his later life, it was said that Leonard rejected the offer of a bishopric, preferring to enter a monastery from which he retreated to the forest nearby, the forest of the Limousin, to live as a hermit. Supposedly, through the intercession of his prayers, the Queen of the Franks, the wife of Clovis I, was safely delivered of a male child, and as a token of thanks, Leonard was given the royal lands at Noblat, where he founded an abbey around which the village grew and was named after him. And I need to note that it was here that we stopped walking back in 2018. We were planning to continue and complete the rest of the Chemin de Vézelay in the summer of 2019. Didn't happen. And then 2020, COVID. 2021, COVID. So guess where we're going May 9th? Finally, we're gonna finish it. So we have the 28 days of walking to finish up, starting May 10th, actually, after we get there. But as I said, luckily we were able to be in France about 3 weeks ago, so I was able to we just kind of drove by some of the spots, the towns that we'll be going through. So farther down the path, a little more than 21 kilometers or So, to the south, the namesake of the Via Lemovicensis, Limoges, holds the shrine of Saint Martial, a 3rd century bishop of the city. So Limoges was founded by the Romans and evangelized by Saint Martial. His tomb rapidly became a large center of pilgrimage. The 11th century Romanesque Abbey of Saint Martial was raised during the French Revolution, unfortunately, but Limoges' 13th century cathedral, dedicated to Saint Stephen, Saint Etienne, still stands. And by the way, the restored crypt of the old Abbey of Saint Martial is located near the present Gothic Cathedral of Saint Etienne, whose 62-meter tower soars above the city's medieval quarter. And you can see we have sunshine when we were there in 2018. When we were there just a couple of weeks ago, we didn't have sunshine. The weather was a little gray. And it served as a clear landmark, as you can see, to those arriving into the city. It served as a, right, I said that, here we go. So 2 13th century bridges still span the Vienne River, one dedicated to Saint Martial, and the other to Saint Stephen. The Saint Martial Bridge was built in 1215 on the foundations of a Gallo-Roman bridge, and the cobbled bridge of Saint Etienne was built to divert some of the traffic away from the Saint Martial Bridge, about 1 kilometer downstream. It was, and still is, on the Chemin du Vézelay, or La Voie de Vézelay. Next slide, please. There we go. It's just a little marker on the bridge. And it's still used by pilgrims going to Santiago to this day. It leads almost directly up to the cathedral through one of the older working class districts of Limoges. And Limoges is also known today for the fine porcelain that has been produced here since the 18th century. And the production of china is, in a sense, an extension to the enamel work for which the city was renowned in the Middle Ages. After Limoges, we came across this small bread, ATM, only in France. We did not use the ATM. The pilgrimage route passes through Chalut, which is still dominated by its 12th century castle keep. Chalut was just one of numerous fortresses throughout Aquitaine, which saw action during the lengthy territory disputes between England and France. Chalut is historically important as it was here where Richard I, the Lionheart, King of England, was besieging Chalut in 1199. Unfortunately, he was wounded by a crossbow and died of his injury. And Richard's successors continued to wage war over their perceived rights to French territory right up to the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453. After leaving Chalut, we cross into the Perigo region of France. And Perigo is a region which pretty much corresponds to the current Burgundian department, and it is an area renowned for its gastronomy. So think black truffles, foie gras, and duck confit. The area was one of the main battlegrounds of the 100 Years' War between the French and the English. And Perigo is the capital, préfecture, of the Dordogne and has a record number of 44 French historical monuments, the earliest dating from the Gallo-Roman period, So just as for St. Leonard, the author of the Pilgrim's Guide says that it is important to visit the tomb of Saint Front, bishop and confessor, who was consecrated bishop in Rome by the apostle St. Peter before it being sent to evangelize this area. And it was around the place of his burial that a small village and then the city grew. The first church was built by Bishop Cronop around 500 to 536 CE or AD, your choice. The Normans destroyed it around 845. And the cathedral, not my photo, unfortunately, as we only caught a glimpse of it as we were navigating and trying to get to the local Pilgrims Association office, which is a tale for another time. So I don't have a picture of it yet. This summer, I will get many pictures of it. It is also inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and its foundations date from the 5th century. Its structure is part Romanesque and Byzantine. Its rooftop is covered with stone cupolas, and again, that's not my photograph. It is considered the largest church with cupolas in Western Europe. After Perigueux, excuse me, the Le Père guide eventually leads pilgrims through Sainte-Foy-la-Grande, and the Miam Miam Dodo route and the Dutch guide both provide a variant through Bergerac to Sainte-Foy-la-Grande, and we opted to go through Bergerac before heading to Sainte-Foy. So the town of Bergerac may recall for you the name Cyrano de Bergerac. A movie was just released. I haven't seen it, but I think it's circulating out there now. So the real Cyrano de Bergerac grew up near Paris in the 1600s on an estate named after this town because its 14th century owner had helped to liberate Bergerac from the English during the 100 Years' War. Even though his connection to this city is tenuous at best, Cyrano de Bergerac became a semi-mythic character after Edmond Rostand's famous play in the late 19th century, and since then has been adopted by the city. A street in the town is named after the playwright, and we actually stayed on this street. And there are 2 statues of Cyrano de Bergerac in town. And this is the largest one and the proudest one, and it's located on Place Pellicière near the church that is dedicated to Saint Jacques, St. James. And with a Romanesque foundation from the 10th century, this church was destroyed numerous times throughout the centuries, but always rebuilt. Its current structure dates from 1685. So after leaving Bergerac, we head to Sainte-Foy-la-Grande, a 13th century bastide, which is a village or town in medieval France that was built especially for defense and usually laid out according to a specific geometric plan. It was market day when we were there, and this slide is just because as we've been driving through the countryside, all of the mimosa was in bloom, and obviously somebody was taking advantage to sell. They went to cut the branches, and they were selling them. The French love their mimosa. They probably like these too, but the town is also named for our old friend, Sainte Foy, Saint Faith of Comte, on the Chemin du Puy, who was a virgin martyr in Gaul, born of a rich Roman father around the year 290. She was baptized in secret in Agen by the bishop, Capret, and when the Roman prefect Dacian began to persecute Christians, her father denounced her to the Roman authorities. She was arrested, tortured, burned on a grill, but never renounced her religion. In the 9th century, the Abbey of Compt risked being abandoned in favor of that of Figeac, as Figeac was easier to access, when a monk from Compt, Erastus, who understood that without a relic from an important saint, Compt would be lost. To put it succinctly, he went to Agen to steal Foy's relics and brought them back to Compt. So that's why I found Sainte-Foy-la-Grande interesting, named after the same saint as on the Le Puy route. You do need to cross the Garonne River on this route as well, even though on the routes leading from Le Puy and Arles, you pass it farther upstream. But here, the Via Lemovicensis makes its way across this broad river just after passing through the hilltop town of La Réole. And what's interesting about this bridge is that pilgrims and cars used to cross over the Garonne River. It was designed by Gustave Eiffel of Eiffel Tower fame. He was still unknown at the time of the bridge's construction. The trail remains fairly flat after you cross this river, and eventually one of the towns that pilgrims come to is Bazas, which is an ancient Gallo-Roman city with origins in the 4th century. It is mainly known for its Gothic cathedral, dedicated to Saint Jean-Baptiste, built between the 13th and the 14th centuries. During the period of religious wars in France, Huguenots penetrated the city and devastated the cathedral. It was rebuilt between 1583 and 1655, and Bishop Arnaud de Pontac saved the triple portal from total destruction and restored it. The cathedral was made a French National Historic Monument in 1840 and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site along with the other monuments on the Voie de Vézelay in 1998. By the time you reach the tiny village of Perigo, you will have passed out of the Gironde and into the Landes department in France. And Landes, or Lanas in the Gascon dialect, means moorland or heath. So Landes and Lanus come from the Latin, Lanus meaning flat, even level plain. So that gives you an idea of what the landscape will be as you continue your way through this department. So the wide deserted expanses of the Landes have since been drained and are a combination of pine forests and agricultural land. Roquefort. Before you get too excited, this is not the Roquefort where the famous cheese is made, no. But it's rather a medieval town that possesses some vestigial remains, like an old bridge from the 11th and 12th centuries, some beautiful bourgeois stone houses, and a Benedictine priory church from the 12th century. Notre Dame of the Assumption was transformed into a massive fortress as a result of the religious wars. Its fortified bell tower was originally the dungeon of a chateau built in the 10th century. When you pass through the tiny village of Perigueux, which possesses a church with a side porch supported by these curious carved wooden capitals, you will see a marker to let you know that you only have 970 kilometers to go to get to Santiago. Ultrea. Mont-de-Marsan is the capital of the Landes department, and it's situated in a picturesque valley at the confluence of the Midou and the Douze rivers, which together they form the Midouze. Next to the tourist office, there was an impressive statue of a diver suspended over the canyon below. And I didn't get the story of this statue, and I'll try and figure out the reason behind this particular statue this summer. So moving on, Saint-Sauvé is endowed with a Romanesque abbey church with a nave that is in transition between Romanesque and Gothic. And somehow, I didn't take any pictures of that. I just took a picture of the sign. I don't know why. But when I was making the slide, I thought I took a picture of it. Saint-Sauvé was one of the biggest monasteries in Aquitaine, founded around the tomb of 5th century missionary Severus, who was killed by Vandals around 405 AD. The abbey church, rebuilt in the 11th century, possesses some remarkable column capitals and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Here too, if needed, you can drop off your hiking shoes to be repaired by Fred on the way to visit the Abbey Church. When we stopped to take pictures of the Jacquard, the albergue there in Saint-Sauvé, the Hospitaliero was just right across the way, and he came out and said, "Do you want to take a tour?" We're like, "Sure." I didn't take any pictures of the inside, though. It was nice. We make our way to Orthez, and it was established as a ford over the Gave du Pau and became an important border town, a strategic military post, and an important stop for pilgrims traveling to Compostela, as it had 3 hospices. Orthez was the capital of Béarn in the late Middle Ages and has the fortifications and fine stone houses to prove it. The town's oldest and most famous monument, the Pont Vieux, the old bridge, dating from the 13th and 14th centuries that allowed pilgrims to Compostela to cross the Po, and the bridge was embellished later with its central tower. In the village of Hôpital d'Orient is a small 13th century church dedicated to Mary Magdalene, a nod to Vézelay, perhaps. Near the church stands a wooden sculpture of a pilgrim. It was just past Hôpital d'Orient that we began to get our first views of the Pyrenees. We maybe would have had earlier glimpses, maybe after Saint-Sauvé, but the weather was for the most part rather overcast and gray. Sauveterre de Béarn is a picturesque medieval village perched above the Gave d'Orient at the edge of the Béarn and on the edge of Basque country. Its Saint-André, Andrew Church, dates from the 12th and 13th centuries, and it is a fortified edifice in the Romanesque Gothic style with a magnificent symphony. Near the church stands the Montréal Tower, a former keep built in the 12th century to protect the town, which is also built in the square architecture shape, truly beloved in the Béarn area. And the Pont de la Légende, or the Legend Bridge, used to completely span the Oléron below, but a flood in 1732 washed away 1/2 of the fortified bridge. It also is a listed historical monument and once played an important role in the defense of the town. Only the 1 arch and 1 fortified gate remain. About 3 kilometers after Sauveterre, we enter into one of the 3 provinces of the Basque Country in France. You have La Soule, the Lower Navarre, and as you can see up there, La Bourg. And these, together with the 4 Spanish counterparts, form l'Euskal Herria, or Le Pays Basque, Basque Country. So when you get into Saint-Palais, you know you're in the heart, or beginnings of, the Basque Country. It was founded in the early 13th century, and though it did not exist in the early days of the pilgrimage to Compostela, it rapidly became the capital of the Lower Navarre, and became a required stopping point for pilgrims to Santiago, given that a pilgrim's hospital was located there. And in traditional Basque fashion, you can see that the houses, or at least this one, so we took picture of one, is painted in the traditional red, and it sometimes is the green pink trim as well. So not too far from Saint-Palais, pilgrims on the Voie de Vézelay and on the GR hiking trails come across the Stele of Gibraltar and join up with pilgrims making their way to Compostela on the routes from Le Puy and Tours. Erected in 1964, it marks a symbolic spot where the 3 paths converge. And in case you were wondering, the name has nothing to do with the British overseas territory at the southern tip of Spain. It derives from the Basque and not from the Arabic. And from the Stele, you only have 2 stages to Ustabat and then Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port before you join the river of pilgrims headed to Santiago de Compostela on the Camino Frances.